Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the July 12th, 2017 meeting of the City of Lake Forest Plan Commission. First, I'd like to introduce the members of the commission who are present here tonight. On your far left is Commissioner Freeman. I'm Michael Lay, Chairman of the Commission. To my immediate left is Commissioner Ruggles, and my far left is Commissioner Pincus. There's two other members who are not here because they have recused themselves from the item agenda number 13 relative to the final plat for the, excuse me, the Wesley planned preservation subdivision. Commissioner Kerr recused herself at the last time we had this before us, I think, which was in December, and since then, Commissioner Berg has also recused himself from consideration of the matter, given that he has a potential appearance of a conflict of interest from a business standpoint. So we'll proceed with it. We have a quorum present, and also present with us is Director of Community Development, Kathy Cerniak. Welcome. So at this point, I would like to take up approval of the minutes from the May 11th Plan Commission meeting, which were sent to the commissioners prior to the meeting for review. I would ask for a motion or consideration of this matter before we proceed.
I move that we approve the minutes as submitted.
Is there a second?
I second.
Okay, it's been moved in second. All those approval of the minutes as submitted indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. The minutes are approved. The main item before us tonight is item number 3, a public hearing and action, consideration of a request for final approval of the final plat for the preserve at Wesley Plan Preservation Subdivision, proposed on a 22-acre site located at 70 Wesley Road. The Commission and City Council previously approved the tentative approval of the preliminary plat, and now this is back to us this evening for final approval. I would point out that this is the fourth time that the commission has had this item before us. Three meetings back in 2016, and now final approval here this evening. So at this time, I would like to call upon either the Lake Forest, the petitioner, the Lake Forest Land Foundation, or the developer, Genco Group, to make a presentation. Please state your name and address, please.
Good evening. My name is Nick Patera, and my company is Tesca Associates, 627 Grove Street, Evanston, Illinois. It's a pleasure to be before you tonight. We have with us this evening representatives of ownership, civil engineering. So if there are questions after I finish, we're happy to answer them for you. I've intended to make this presentation short and to the point because we've been before you a number of times, but I do have some updates and information that have been included in as part of staff report. The staff report is very complete, and I don't want to go back over that, but I think we can go back and ask questions. The few things that I wanted to go through were some fine-tuning and refinements that we've made since we last looked at this plan, and also to go over some of the commitments that we had made that were conditions of approval, and just to demonstrate that we listened and followed through with this. One of which has to do with conservation easements. On the screen shows the final plat of subdivision. You can see the entire 22 acres shown in shape of the outline of the property with the lower subdivision of the 9 lots. That remains exactly the same as what you had seen with a slight refinement to some parking that I'll get into, that we want to make sure we've got sufficient guest parking for resident and visitors. The important part about this is showing conservation easement. Going from left to right, that's the north right-of-way or parkway area along Wesley Road, that we have a minimum of 50-foot conservation easement that was stipulated as part of Plan Commission. It runs up to the rear lot lines on lots 7, 8, and 9. You see it a little bit wider on the right-hand side as it goes past some of the pond area and past the entrance. It still maintains a minimum of 50 feet. That jog is about a 15-foot, like a 65-foot altogether width to create this conservation easement. The reason being is that we want to maintain a wooded, vegetated buffer along Wesley Road. And one of the things that we're doing with our landscape plan is filling in with plantings the former Dickinson residence driveway, so we maintain that buffer, and we're located present adjustments that we made. The single-family residence. On the left-hand side, there's 2 of them, approximately the 65-foot wide wetland and landscape buffer easement on the west side, and then continues with a little bit narrower 50-foot landscape buffer easement. They're essentially there for drainage purposes, to maintain wooded vegetation, and also to enhance and provide further landscape enhancement at the very far north one to benefit the Webbs on Wallace Road. There eventually will become a trail, and we've ownership has met with the Webbs, and they have come to an understanding of what type of evergreen plantings would be put in to that northernmost portion of the landscape buffer easement. I can go more into this, but I think that somewhat explains the intent. The other thing I wanted to express, the 2 circled areas, the kind of oval elliptical on the left-hand side, top left, that's an evergreen planting that I was referring to that would be placed on site with consensus between city and neighbor, the Webbs, as to the location. It's showing evergreen tree plantings at that location. I had mentioned before, at the middle bottom of the page, just above the Wesley word, there's proposed plantings of evergreen trees and some larger deciduous trees, lindens, Norway spruce, that would fill in the gap where the present Dickinson driveway is located to maintain that vegetated buffer along Wesley Road. I want to call your attention to the two cul-de-sac courts that I'll show you in larger detail. We have landscape in those two courts, the auto court and the landscape center medians, but what we've done is tucked in some parking spaces into those. They're big enough that we can accommodate 3 on the west one, which is on the left side of the image, and 4 on the east one, right side, and still provide screening, planting. We tried to make sure that when you're still approaching, you're looking at landscape and not at parking. This is similar to what you would see if you went into Conway or some other places. We also have, each one of the homes will have enough parking on their driveway in addition to 2-car garage. Every home will still have 2 or more cars that can still park in their driveways. So if it's a holiday, a visitors, it's a party, they can still park in their own lots on their own parcels, but we wanted to make sure that we had enough room in the event that there are additional cars that needed a place to park for short term in these 2 courts. I'll show you those, and this is the green area is the landscape portion of these cul-de-sac areas that would remain with heavy plantings to screen fronts of cars, but you're not seeing them until you really come around to the other side to park. The other thing that we did, you'll see 5 circles on this plan. Those are lights. They're about 150 foot apart. We wanted to provide some discrete lighting with shielded source, so we're not showing the bulb or the source of the light, but it's a downcast type light. There's a picture that's hard to see on the far right, but there's a shade, and the bulb of the light is up within that concealed source to shine down. But at the front entry coming in off of Wesley, there's one, and it's about 130 feet or so to the second one at the intersection of the cul-de-sac, another one as you approach the back cul-de-sac, and then there's one on each one of the courts islands themselves, so that these are quiet, but they're here for just direction and guidance, and not really trying to provide a great degree of illumination, but just some kind of night lighting without disturbing the dark sky aspect that this neighborhood enjoys. Back to the auto court areas, again, I'm showing you this because this is a slight change from what was approved with our previous plan commission, a tentative plat, and you can see the extent of landscape with the somewhat of a black and white before and in color after on the west court and on the east courts to accommodate guest parking. Have followed the final detailed plans, and I'd be welcome to any questions that you might have at this point, but I think this is a good enough overview to stop and listen to anything you might have at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Kathy?
Thank you, Chairman Lane, members of the commission. As Mr. Patera said, this plat is back before you for final approval. The code does require that subdivisions go through a 2-phase process. The tentative approval essentially is where all the work was done, to put it frankly. The Plan Commission did spend 3 fairly long meetings, heard a fair amount of testimony. Plan Commission spent time talking about density, talking about the conventional plan, and even explored alternative conventional plans, understanding how the overlay district works. As part of the earlier approval, the Plan Commission did recommend rezoning of this property from R5 to R4. The City Council did support that rezoning. They also supported the tentative plat as you recommended it, which means the City Council approved the overall layout, the number of lots. The Plan Commission also talked about the access location. In response to Plan Commission discussion at the early meetings and public comment, the developer made a number of changes. There were some slight shifting to the lot configuration. The access driveway and the point at which it intersects with Wesley was shifted to the west. Importantly, a conservation easement was established and is reflected on the plat all along the frontage of the property along Wesley Road. And also importantly, there is a landscape easement that extends along the west property line. The property owners to the west who will be most affected, most exposed to the trail in the nature preserve, the Webbs, who are here this evening. They've been very involved in discussions about this property for a number of years, even before this current subdivision came forward. So that landscape buffer really is very specifically to assure that going forward there is a landscape buffer maintained to screen those existing homes in the North Carroll Meadows from the nature trail, but also from lights or rooftops of new homes in the development. The landscape plan does identify that there will be a cluster of evergreens planted in that area. City staff would recommend an additional condition that just, although it's our intent, just to make it clear that in citing those trees specifically, that the city would like to be involved with the developer on site as those are located, and we would communicate with the Webbs to also invite them to participate in that. Importantly, the landscape buffer, once established on the plat, is there in perpetuity, so it does give the city the ability to work with open lands if one or more of the trees fails to thrive. We would require that it be replaced. If there's an unanticipated gap, although the trees aren't intended to shield all views, but if generally the intent of providing sufficient screening isn't achieved, we could certainly work with Lake Forest Open Lands in the future to enhance that area. You do have a recommendation in the staff report for approval of the final plat. You have a number of conditions. There's numerous reviews as we go through before this moves forward to the city council. There would be one further review. The city engineer has reviewed the final engineering plans. I believe there's a couple of I's to be dotted, T's to be crossed. That would be reviewed before we go to the city council, and then final city approvals would need to be in place before the fees are paid and the plat is recorded. Once the plat is recorded, work could begin on the site once the permits were issued. So if you choose to do so, it would be appropriate to forward a recommendation to the city council in support of approval of the final plat, subject to the conditions in the staff report. Adding a condition, just making the point that the city would coordinate with both Lake Forest Open Lands and the neighbors to the west at the time those evergreen trees are planted. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Before we go to questions, I would like to ask the commissioners whether or not any of you have had any or have any conflicts of interest or ex parte contacts on this matter before this evening's meeting.
None.
Seeing none, we'll proceed. Questions for either the petitioner or Ms. Zerniak about this matter?
Kathy, can you help us understand the genesis of these parking spaces? I'm glad that Nick talked about them. That kind of jumped off the page when I sat down here and looked at these. What was the idea behind that? How did that develop? Is it a concern about emergency vehicle access to the site? And what led to that?
I think early on we did raise some questions with the developer about whether there was sufficient visitor spaces. Certainly each home will have a 2-car garage, will have room in the driveway, but because this is a private street, providing some non-street parking is really important to avoid the street getting completely closed off. If someone had a large party, certainly there could be parking on one side, but on an everyday basis, if there's a landscape truck in there, it really does help to have some off-street parking, especially when you have these small lot neighborhoods.
And this has been reviewed with, fire and et cetera, because it just concerns me a little bit that rather than making the island in the middle there smaller and having more access, because you can fill those spaces and then have somebody parking on the street, and I just worry about emergency access to the homes. If you've got people in the spaces and on the street, you've now really tightened up that space.
The cul-de-sac, the radius will still need to meet the city requirements. So by virtue of adding the parking spaces, they are not creating a radius that does not meet city standards. So the city engineer does review that in consultation with the fire department. Certainly, in these tight neighborhoods, if someone has a large party, that is something that perhaps the declaration of covenants would need to address.
Yeah, and I don't know, Nick, maybe you could address it, but, to me, the idea of a smaller landscape island makes a little more sense here, because you've no way of knowing that 4 is going to be enough. And for that matter, on the everyday basis, you probably don't need to be looking at 4 type of arrangements.
Spaces was intentionally set so that I didn't destruct the view as you approached the cul-de-sacs. Those are important to me. Secondly, the parking spaces themselves are sufficiently deep so that if somebody doesn't pull in all the way, or if I have a oversized vehicle, the tail of that vehicle is not going to hang out beyond the cul-de-sac radius. And partly that's a function of being able to back out again. I think your question goes back to, do we really need them? I've watched the back and forth activity at Conway, and I think that's a pretty good example. They've been there long enough, and they do have some of these, call it secondary, support parking. So I do think that we've screened them well enough. You bring up a good point that you don't want to end up having somebody blocking emergency vehicle fire access, and I think that's something that we have to manage within our HOA and covenants, which we can do. It happens that the one on the east cul-de-sac is opposite a stretch of road that presumably you could park a car there. The west one doesn't quite have that problem unless you really are not paying attention. You really aren't going to park in front of somebody's driveway as a parallel on the street. So I don't know that we have a great degree of disobedience that's going to cause this to happen as a fire truck or emergency vehicle comes through here and not be able to get access.
Yeah, you called out the space I'm worried about. Those spaces, particularly the western two of the two on that larger island at the east end of the property. If somebody were if there were a line of cars parked along the street there, I'd just worry about how an emergency vehicle gets in there. But it just looks a little tight.
Yeah, and those are the ones that are, well, both of them are a little bit deeper. I need to have a dimension that's wide or deep enough so when I pull out, I can make the turn, and like you're pulling out of a normal parking space at a grocery store or something. This isn't like that, but the dimension still applies. And so that the depth of this parking space is actually overly deep, because the road isn't as wide as a normal, shopping center aisle. It's intentionally kept narrow because we're trying to keep the scale and the character of this lane kind of quiet and low key.
All right, well, I don't want to prolong it, but as long as we're clear that the fire department has had a look at that and they're comfortable with that spacing, then I defer to the experts, but it looks pretty tight.
We could certainly add a condition that in the final review of the plans, that the city engineer and the fire department review those parking spaces again and verify that they are workable.
Okay. That's all I had. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Kathy.
Further questions?
I have a question for Kathy. The conservation easement and the landscape buffer easement, who has responsibility for maintenance of that?
I'm going to let the developer respond. I believe it's Lake Forest Open Lands.
Commissioner, that is on the Lake Forest Open Lands property, that they will be managing and maintaining both the new plantings as well as the existing plantings that are within those buffers, as well as the other greater part of the property.
Yeah, thank you. That's,
Questions?
No, Commissioner Freeman.
Okay. I have, I have no further questions. Given that that's the case, let's move on to public testimony. For those of you here present who wish to address the commission on this agenda item, will you please stand, and I would like to swear you in. Nobody wishes to testify? Okay. Let the record show that. Okay, final questions from the commission to the petitioner's staff. Seeing none, we'll then move to petitioner. You have anything final to say to the commission? Okay. Kathy, any further comments?
Nothing further. We will follow up on the parking spaces, and again, if you want to incorporate that as an additional motion, we can figure out the wording, and a motion making it clear that we'll coordinate with Open Lands and the neighboring property owners as those evergreen trees get sited on the west side.
Good. Okay, then it'd be appropriate for a motion to approve as recommended the final plat subdivision of this proposed development with, go ahead,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Chairman, I'd recommend approval of the final plat of subdivision for the Preserve at Wesley, 770 West Wesley Road Planned Preservation Subdivision. The recommendation for approval of the final plat is the and also the curb approved or reviewed by the city, including the fire department, for emergency personnel access to the homes, including if there's parking, car vehicles in that area, full consideration by the fire department. And that should happen before it goes to city council.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to recommend approval of the staff recommendation with the now 6 conditions contained in the report and added as an amendment.
And for clarification, would you also like to add a condition specifying the coordination on those plantings along the west perimeter?
Sure.
I would consider that a friendly amendment. Okay. Okay, all those in favor of the motion indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries 4-0. That completes our consideration of that item. I would ask item number 4, is there anybody at the meeting here from the public wishes to address the Plan Commission on matters not on the agenda this evening? Okay, seeing none. Kathy, any final additional information from staff?
I do expect the Plan Commission to have a meeting in August. I believe that meeting date is August 9th. And I expect at that time you will consider a request from Chase Bank for approval of a bank, which is a special use, and a drive-through at the location that is currently occupied by McDonald's on Waukegan Road. The car wash at Everett and Waukegan, they are working with ComEd to resolve an easement issue, which may allow them to do some shifting on the site. That is not likely to come back to you until September, because we don't yet have any new materials to review. But you will have a meeting on August 9th.
Very good. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you all for who came to the meeting and attended this evening. And so the agenda having been completed, motion to adjourn is in order.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. We are adjourned.